Okay, hi. Thanks for coming. Today what we're going to talk about is the concept, the midah, the idea of criticism, tochecha. And it says in the Torah, there's a pasuk in the Torah in Sefer Vayikra where it says, hold on, I'll share the screen so you can see it. Whoever wants to read. Okay, here, I'll make this. Second. Okay, so present. There we go. Okay, so now we're doing the idea of tochecha, of criticism, and we get this mitzvah from Sefer Vayikra where it says lo tisneh et achicha b'levavecha, hochech tochiach et amitecha ve'lo tisa alav chet. So it's saying, don't hate your brother in your heart. Give rebuke to someone in your nation, and and don't not to bring sin upon him. There's actually a couple ways to interpret that last part, which we'll talk about as we progress the class. So what I want to do in this class tonight is two things. Well, a few things, but the two main things I want to do is look is first develop and see why is this commandment at all. Why is there this idea that we should be reprimanding, or when I say criticizing, it doesn't mean, oh, you look bad. I'm talking about constructive criticism, right? Of telling someone who's doing something they shouldn't be, how to correct their ways. So constructive criticism or reprimanding, so to speak, that it's not telling someone they don't look nice, So that's that. Well, we'll go more into that, but that's what we're talking about. So what exactly is that, and why is this a commandment? Why do I have to tell anyone anything? Why can't I just live my own life and work on me, doing what I need to do, and me, perfecting myself, and not worrying about what everyone else thinks? So why is this a commandment, and how do we do this? How do we fulfill this commandment correctly? So what I want to start with is examples in the Torah and the Nevi'im, actually mostly in the Nevi'im, that show us people who gave tochecha, but they gave it inappropriately or too late, or something was not good, not done properly with the tochecha, and how we can learn from that. So the first example I want to talk about is Eli Kohen. In Sefer Shmuel, Eli was the spiritual leader, and his sons, the Navi tells us, his sons were evil. They were Bnei Belial. They were corrupting the Mishkan. They were stealing from people. They were mistreating the women. They were making the whole. They were stealing food from the people, and it was just not an environment, thus causing a lot of people not to want to come to the Mishkan if they were going to be treated like this. So Eli hears about this, and it starts off by saying, Eli zaken me'od. He's very old. So at this point, the Navi is going on. He hears this, meaning he's not himself so involved in the day-to-day of the Mishkan. Hold on, tell me my internet's unstable, so I'm just gonna go out of full screen. Maybe that'll help in case it's freezing up. I'll just do like this. So yeah, okay. Anyway, sorry. So he wasn't. We see that he was in the Mishkan because we hear other stories that he was physically in the Mishkan, but it seemed that he wasn't involved in the day-to-day because his sons seemed to have taken over, and he hears that they're not acting correctly. It says the way that so some interpret that as they actually raped the women, or they made them stay overnight. They mistreated the women, that they made them stay late and not return home. So he says, and then finally he tells his sons, Lama tasuk why did you do these things that I'm hearing about? It's not good what I'm hearing. And then this pasuk is a little bit confusing, but it explains sort of where his head's at. So he basically gives this little cryptic pasuk, which sort of seems to say, if you sin towards God, who's going to help you? But if you sin to man, then maybe God will help you. So it's like he's putting the focus on the sin of God, towards the Mishkan, and not the sin towards the people, the interpersonal relationships. So we see from the story a couple things. Number one, that he was zaken. He wasn't necessarily so involved with his sons. He didn't have such a relationship with them at this point. He wasn't able to influence them in the proper way. The Hamim also say this was a very mild rebuke for what they were doing. He just said, this isn't nice. He didn't really, it was too late and his focus was wrong. And we see that later that the Torah basically says, it says, it's like the Navi interprets this as if he didn't even rebuke them, right? And it says that God wanted to punish them. It was already too late for them. They lost their chance to tshuva for how evil they were being, and his rebuke was ineffective because it was too late, and it was therefore seeming to be unimpactful. So we see from this that in order to have an impact, I'm looking at the reverse now, is you have to have a connection with that person so that you can influence them, and it should come out of a relationship and of respect and mutual understanding of each other, and not, I sort of imagine they just rolled their eyes at him and brushed it off like, oh, you old man, you don't know what's going on, So there was no connection there. There was no need of respect or need to build that connection, or feeling that I need to better my ways. I let you down, so to speak. There was none of that. The next example I want to look at is the son of David, Adoniah. So David was at this point also, by the way, interestingly, he's also very old at this point. So it's showing there's a disconnect between generations, that we really have to sort of understand the level of the person we're talking to. We're talking to. I'll talk more about that when we talk about rebuke of children and teachers and all that, and parents. So David was old at this point. He was already, at the end of his life. This is the beginning of Sefer Melachim. And that he starts to make this whole entourage, and which is what Avshalom did when he was rebelling. So it seems that he's going to start to take power, and David doesn't do anything about this, and he doesn't say anything. He doesn't rebuke him. He lets him do it. He knows about it, and he lets him do it. And this then, but however, this is a problem because we already knew previously, and David knew that God told him that Shlomo was going to be the next king, and he had to anoint Shlomo, and Adoniah was not going to be the next king. But he didn't do anything about this when Adoniah started to take power. So Natan Hanavi and Bathsheba, Shmuel's mother, Shlomo's mother, have to go in and tell him, do you see what's going on? Open your eyes. Isn't Shlomo supposed to be king? Why do I keep saying Shlomo? Shlomo. Isn't Shlomo supposed to be king? And he ends up, going, and they anoint Shlomo. He becomes king, and this was the wrong story. And he rectifies the situation, but it's a little too late in the sense of Adoniah still feels a little bit entitled, and that even after the death of David, even after his death, he asks Shlomo to marry Avishaga Shunamit, who was one of his Pilagshim, which we see from Sefer Shmuel, that marrying someone's Pilegesh, marrying a king's Pilegesh, a king's concubine, was a sign of power and status. And we see that with Avner ben Ned, who marries who sleeps with the Tzva Bataya. And when Avshalom sleeps with the Pilagshim of David in the tent on the roof, show in front of all the nation. So we see his request there is an act of rebellion, and he ends up getting killed for that. So we see that that this all could have been avoided if David would have rebuked him at this point, or maybe even would have anointed Shlomo beforehand. But this lack of rebuke, and again, this discrepancy in age and understanding, I think, because he's also old at this point, like Eli, this disconnect in a relationship leads to the inability to see the need for rebuke, or the inability to have the rebuke or the criticism be taken seriously. And just a side point, this is not the first time David misjudges his children. He has a lot of issues with, unfortunately, with his children. And we see that from that David was a great leader, but there was some interpersonal family stuff that was not great. Feel free to listen to my previous series on Sefer Shmuel about that. Very interesting stuff, but not so relevant to this specifically. Okay, so we just spoke about two negative examples, or not negative, but two examples where rebuke and criticism didn't work properly. And now we're going to talk, I want to jump to the example of the ideal rebuke, or the ideal criticism, because this story ends in a very positive note. So I'm going to make this bigger so you can see, because that's a lot if anyone wants to read along or look at the psukim. Basically, this is also about David, but earlier in his life, that David, when he sins with Bathsheba, Natan HaNavi comes up to him and he gives him the famous, well-known parable, the mashal of the kivsa harash. So what happens? I'm just going to paraphrase it quickly. We don't need to go through all the psukim, but basically he tells him there's this rich man who has, sheep and cattle and all, has very rich. And there's a poor man that has one sheep that he loves and he takes care of. And he's very in love with the sheep and proud of the sheep, and spends all his energy on the sheep. And the rich man steals the sheep from the poor man. And what should I do? And David right away, he's angry. He gets very angry about this man, and he tells Natan that this man should be sentenced to death. And then Natan says, you are the man. So through this, I skipped a bunch of psukim, and then through this mashal, David ends up saying Chatati la Hashem, and he is able to repent and not die. He gets punished, but he doesn't get death like he gave to the man. Natan says, don't worry, you won't die. You will get punished, but you won't die. So from this, we see that if Natan would have came to David and said, how could you have done this? You're horrible. You're the king. You have all these wives and all these, all the whole world, the whole land to choose from, all the people, all everything, and you chose the wife of, of someone that was already married, one of your soldiers, and how could you have done such a thing? David most probably would have been defensive, would have tried to cover himself, but he doesn't, and not have done tshuva. But when Natan is able to do it, first of all, we know that Natan and David had a very close relationship. So he's doing this out of connection, out of love, right? And he makes him understand it himself, right? He makes him realize this guy did the wrong thing. And then when he sees it's about Ataish, he's able to realize, wow, Achatati Hashem, right? I also sinned. And this reminds me of something when I was in college many years ago. I think she's out of the department there now at this point, but she taught me abnormal psychology about it keeps telling me my internet is unstable when I go to full screen. So let me yeah, there we go. I just don't want to freeze it up. Okay. So sorry, Brooklyn College, Professor Miles, she taught me she taught a class called abnormal psychology, which she taught all, different psychological disorders, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, all different things. And she said, I remember this so clearly, that she said in the beginning of the class, like of the semester, that she said a lot of people through this class will see that their loved ones, people in their family, their parents, spouses, kids, whatever, might have some of these things. When you read when you learn about these disorders, and that they want to get them help and everything. So she said the best advice I give my students or anyone is is to that thinks this is to print out the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is the the book of all the mental health disorders, and it has all like criteria of description or the criteria of what that disorder entails. And she said I would print that out and leave it on the table or somewhere that the person will see, and have them read it. And then you're not attacking them, but it's like, oh, I left my notes from my psychology class somewhere, and they look at it and then maybe they'll see themselves in that, uh, in that disorder or something, and then maybe and then hopefully want to get help themselves. So I always thought that was a very interesting idea. It applies to everything. It doesn't only apply to mental health. It applies to really anything about knowing yourself or accepting criticism about anything that needs to change in yourself. Is unless it comes from within, our first response is usually defensive and not agreeing with with what the person will tell us. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So I also want to say, wait, there was something else I want. Oh, she also, interesting. This is also, I thought was very interesting. She said that she is or was, I don't know exactly what she does now, but she was also a private clinical psychologist, and she said she would never treat people with personality disorders because people with personality disorders like narcissism or defiance disorder, part of the disorder is that they can't truly see their faults and themselves. They can't be objective in a way that really allows them to see their own faults. So they never see that they need to change. So she said, I personally don't take those cases because I feel like because they can't see that they need to change, I can never help them, improve themselves. So I just thought that was also, these are all very interesting things in terms of mental health and all the series that we're talking about is our midot, our character traits, and it's so hard to change our character traits, right? To all these things, it's very easy to talk about and say, like we talked about being less in previous classes, being less judgmental or having more gratitude or not being angry, and all these things sound really nice and are very easy to talk about. But if that's our inclination and our default, it's very hard to build on that and to change that. So seem to even more so when someone's criticizing or trying, giving us constructive criticism and saying, maybe you should work on your anger, or maybe you should work on being less judgmental, how quickly we could shut down. So what we see from Natan Hanavi and David is that when you do it in a way that's a roundabout way, and a way that the person themselves sees their own faults and could realize it in a way that they don't feel attacked, then they're able to do the true tshuva and really work on themselves. So that, I think this is what a lot of Chachamim look at as the prime example of an ideal tochacha, an ideal a negative a positive review, criticism, constructive criticism. Sorry. Then I want to look at for a second the idea of how to give criticism, right? From this, let's springboard. So we should, I'll go to that in a second. We should always make sure that we don't have the fault ourselves, right? Like I don't want to go and if if I'm always gossiping, I'm not going to go to my brother or my mother or my friend or whoever and be like, you really shouldn't gossip. It's not right. If I'm the one always also gossiping, if I work on myself and I stop gossiping, then maybe I could say, I'd really rather not talk about that person or that thing that, it's not appropriate. We have to always work on ourselves before we start pointing fingers at someone else. And even if we work so hard and we're really awesome in that specific thing, we always have to realize before we critique anyone else is that no matter what, everyone has faults, right? So even if I'm amazing, I'm the least judgmental person ever, and I always give everyone the benefit of the doubt, and I'm telling you, maybe you should give someone the benefit of the doubt. Don't think I'm all high and mighty because of that, because I have my faults as well. Everyone has their faults. It might not be that specific thing, but we all have faults, therefore to be empathetic, right? And in that same vein, to be an example for that person in a way that you act in an appropriate way, so they could look and say, oh, I want to be like that person. And I forgot where I read this, but it said, don't be excited to rebuke someone, because if you're excited and you want to be like, oh, you're so, don't do that, it means that you're not coming from a positive place, from a genuine place. Because if you're coming from a genuine place, you should feel bad about it. You should be like, I wish I didn't have to do this, but I want to help this person get better. And it should always come out of love and concern with the relationship, and so it could be received well. And this is when I bought the next pasuk from the Chachamim that says, "Hevei mit hamidav shel Aaron," a very famous saying, from Avot, Ohev Shalom, Rodef Shalom, Ohevet Habriot, Karban Torah. So what does this have to do with rebuke? Aaron Kohen, right? It says he was a lover of peace. He ran after peace, and he loved all briot, all creations, and he brought them closer to Torah. So what does this have to do? What does this teach us about rebuke? It teaches us that you can't in order to really criticize and to critique someone and help them better themselves, it has to come from a place of love and relationship and empathy. And I love Mr. Rogers, and I think in a way, like Mr. Rogers is sort of the modern day Aharon that really, like, he ended his shows, with always saying, "You made this day special by just being you. There's no person in the world like you, and I like you just the way you are." And he said that knowing that we can be loved exactly as we are, gives us all the best opportunity for growing into the healthiest of people. So basically, I think that's really mirroring what the Hachamim are saying about Aharon, is saying that if we feel accepted for who we are and where we are, then we'll be able to build on that, and we don't feel like we're being put down and how bad you are and you're horrible and all that, because you're able to build on the confidence and the love that the person is putting in you and giving you, that's giving you rebuke. And that's why that I talk the idea of it says right, someone who's in your nation, someone who's connected to you, should be the one you're giving rebuke. You should be rebuking. You're not going to rebuke a stranger on the street. If you see some random person yelling at their kid and you think they're not acting appropriately, it's not your place. I mean, I guess if it's, God forbid, an abusive way, protect the kid. But if it's just, yelling at yelling or whatever, it's not your place to do that. But if it's your, I don't know, your very good friend or your spouse or whatever, you could talk to them and be like, listen, I don't think you handle a situation with so-and-so well, and say it in a nice, loving way to help them realize to correct themselves. And this, I want to go back to the original the first pasuk that I said we'll talk about now, which I want to talk about, is the way that ends with lo tisal al chet. So so there's one interpretation that says so that he won't sin, right? You want to critique them and rebuke them so that they will stop sinning, right? They will stop doing whatever wrong act they're doing. But on the other hand, it also can be interpreted as that he shouldn't cause you to sin, that you shouldn't sin because of this. What does that mean? That you shouldn't be shaming him and embarrassing him and causing yourself to do a sin, by embarrassing and shaming this person through your rebuke. And also, like we see, I mean, unfortunately, I don't really want to give this example because it's whatever. It's not a good example. Anyway, but I'll just say, there's certain things that when people try to tell you to do better, it ends up being a negative thing instead of a positive thing, and could end up being a chilul Hashem, whatever. Anyway, and I always think of this idea about rebuking through love and rebuking through care and relationship. I taught in a middle school for many years. I was obviously a student, in my life, and I always thought, especially as a student. Also as a teacher, but especially as a student, when the teacher would yell at the class, I remember just sitting there and being like, this is not helping anyone. You're not benefiting, the students end up getting angry at the teacher. They don't like that teacher. They just feel like she hates them or he hates them, and they're not really wanting to build a relationship and respect that teacher, and it has, with all kids, Rambam says when a parent or a teacher reprimands a child, that they should act like they're angry and not really be angry. Because if you're really angry, I think I spoke about this a little bit in the anger class, but if you're really angry, then your emotions take charge, as opposed to acting angry where you're really doing this for the benefit of the child, that they learn that act is inappropriate. So admit that you struggle with the same thing, empathize. And I think this especially with teachers or parents, a lot of times, especially younger children, will look at their adult role models in their life, their parents, their teachers, as infallible. And if you tell them, when I was a kid, I also had this problem, or I also, couldn't do this, or was unable to control myself, or whatever it may be, and you become relatable to them, then they themselves will want to do better and will feel less threatened. So I think that's a tactic in teaching and parenting, in the way to relate and connect to a child, instead of just yelling at them and say, how could you be so stupid to do, X, Y, and Z, or to not listen to me, or to throw that, whatever. And to say, when I was a kid, also that was hard for me. It was hard for me to, to share, or it was hard for me to, play with my brother, not push my brother when I was annoyed, or whatever it is. So to really be on their level, and that I think goes back to the Eli and the David being Zaken when they didn't rebuke their children well. It's they were disconnected. They weren't on their level. And this doesn't mean that we should act like children. No, we're mature, we're adults, but to see them eye to eye, And I think, back to the Mr. Rogers thing, but I think that was that was why he was so popular and why he was so influential, was he was able to really do that. And obviously I didn't know Aharon Kohen, but that's what they say he was able to do, to really relate to people on all their levels. Another thing we have to realize is take a step back and not say you always do this, not generalize, not make these big these big demands of the person. Like if someone has trouble with something, step by step, be like, oh, maybe you should work on this, or maybe you should focus more on that. Like for example, if someone is like is super disorganized, you're not going to tell them to start, setting up a filing cabinet and have every single paper they ever, did in order. But maybe, let's work on organizing this drawer, just as an example. So, to really think of it as a step by step, and to think of yourself, how hard it is to change something in yourself. So how hard it is for someone to change. So when you're giving that critique, to really give it from a sensitive place, and then specifically, so that it's like little bite-sized things they could chew, and be patient, because think about how long and hard it takes you to work on your faults, and to allow them to also have the time to work on what they need to fix. What I want to sort of end with, or last topic, or last idea, is the idea of ourselves accepting criticism, is you personally accepting criticism. And when someone tells you to work on something, and the first natural response for most people, I can speak for myself and I'll bring some examples, but the first natural response is to be defensive and to say and we see this in the Torah with Adam and or to blame, to be defensive and to blame. And we see this with Adam and Chava, right? With the first sin, right? When they eat from Etzadat, and God calls out to them and says, Ayeka, and he says, how do you know you're naked? Oh, you ate from Etzadat. Why did you eat it? Adam blames the woman blames the snake, right? And the whole blame game. And we also see this with Cain, right? When Cain kills Hevel, he says, God says, where's Hevel? What, I have to, my brother's keeper, right? And then God says, and in both of these instances, by the way, God gives them the opening to repent. He tells, like with Adam and Chava, he says, Ayeka, and he says, who told you you're naked, right? He gives them the opening to say we made a mistake. Also with Cain, he says, he gives them the opening of where's Hevel, to sort of say, I did this wrong thing. I didn't bring this in, but also I'll just say quickly, is when Shaul doesn't kill Amalek. I didn't bring the psukim, but he gives a laundry list of excuses. He was king of excuses, and blaming the people, and being like, oh, it was the people's fault. I just did this. It wasn't a big deal. And this deflecting. By the way, we brought Eli as a negative example with his sons, that he didn't rebuke them properly, but he takes rebuke or criticism well, because when he sees Hannah praying and she was just moving her mouth and he thought she was drunk, right? It says Rak Svatei, and she says, no, I'm not drunk. I was just so distraught that the words couldn't even come out. I was just mumbling. And then he doesn't even ask her what she's distraught about and what she prayed for. He just says, whatever you prayed for should come true. You should get whatever you prayed for, meaning he totally trusts her and he accepts the rebuke. So it's just interesting to see the two sides of Eli in that sense. So I think that from these both things, from the idea of when you hear rebuke, and you think, even if it's not given appropriately, like we said, to give it out of love and all that, even if someone's saying something in not such a nice way, and your first response is to shut down and say, no, that's not right, that's not who I am, that you should really stop for a second and think, and say, maybe there's some truth in this. Maybe it's not all true, but maybe there is something I have to work on. Maybe not to that extreme that the person's, yelling at me or making me feel bad about, but maybe there is something that I need to correct in myself and use it as an act of reflection. Um, the Rambam says that someone who refuses to accept criticism will never be able to do tshuva and will never be able to connect to God, right? Because not being able to accept constructive criticism essentially cuts you off from relationships with people and relationships to God. There's actually someone who I mean, this is years ago, but I was very friendly with someone, and I remember anytime I told her anything, any slight criticism of like, oh, like maybe next time you should remember X, Y, and Z, or why don't we, whatever. And she was always so defensive and always blamed everyone else that I just distanced myself from her because it wasn't enjoyable to be friends with her, So same thing with God. If we're not able to accept our criticisms and our faults and work on fixing those, then we're not going to be able to develop a relationship with God. So I think that we have to realize that accepting criticism and being open to allowing ourselves to see our faults allows us to maintain healthy relationships with people and also help maintain healthy relationship with God, because we always have to see ourselves clearly. And this is why the two things that Chamim talk about, the idea of knelecha chaver, right? To have a friend, a true friend that's going to mirror you and help you be your best self. And some Nachamim say that's what a spouse is, right? That's why it says ezer kenegdo, right? A spouse should be someone who helps you build on yourself, build yourself up and helps you perfect yourself. But it doesn't necessarily need to be a spouse. It could be any good friend. It could be a sibling. It could be a parent. It could be someone who really, truly knows and respects you, and you respect them, and you're able to look at that. They could look at you clearly, and you could accept what they say clearly, in order to be your best self, and connect to God and connect to people. You're being your best self, and I opened up a little bit with the question of why is this a mitzvah, like bichlal? Why is this something that we need to do? Why do we have this mitzvah? Why doesn't everyone just mind their own business and I try to be good myself? And I think it's all what we said basically. It's number one, you can't do it all yourself because no one's fully objective. So no one could fully know. Everyone's always about themselves, first of all. You're always subjective about yourself. So you need someone else to be able to tell you, work on this or be conscious of that, and so on. And also, we have the idea of arevut, of responsibility, of achrayut, of one another, that all of Israel is connected. And we have to really all care about each other's well-being, whether that be in times of pain or in times of happiness, and to really, have this unity and realize that we're all one, and therefore, if someone is struggling or needs to better themselves, I should help them, and obviously in a way of love, in a way of compassion, and without negativity and accusation and judgment. So I didn't really go into this, but I just want to end with the idea of self-criticism and being overly critical could also be negative, because then when you're overly critical of yourself, you shut down. Or if the same way if someone's overly critical of you or of another, they shut down and don't want to hear it. So there's always there has to be this fine balance between realistic steps that I can take in order to fix whatever I feel like I want to perfect and fix, and also realizing, I just said the word perfect, but realizing that there is no perfect when it comes to Midot, and it's always going to be a challenge, and always going to be climbing uphill, and we have to embrace that challenge and accept the challenge and use the people in our life to as lights or springboards or whatever analogy you want to take of where we are on that ladder, on that mountain of the challenge. So I hope this helps us, accept criticism more and give criticism in a positive way, in an influential way, in a helpful way. So yeah, thank you for coming, and hope to see you next week. Have a good day. Good night.